My dad laughed first. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of laugh that assumes the room belongs to him, that invites everyone else to join in before they've decided whether they should. He tipped his glass, glanced at my hands, and said, "My little hobby was cute, like a grown woman collecting seashells." Forks paused midair. Someone snorted. Then my sister's fiancé, a Navy SEAL who hadn't said 10 words all night, went pale. His fork slipped from his fingers and clanged against the plate. He stared at me like he'd seen a ghost and whispered, "Wait, are you Rear Admiral Hart?" Everyone laughed right up until he stood and snapped to attention. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and warm bread, the kind of meal that pretends everything is fine because the table is set and the napkins are folded. My mother's old chandelier hummed softly overhead, one bulb always a shade dimmer than the others. Dad had insisted on hosting at his place, said it was easier, said it was tradition, said it with that tone that meant the decision was already made. The oak table still carried the nick I'd put in it at 16 when I set down a pan too hot. He'd lectured me for an hour then. Tonight he sat at the head like the nick had never happened. My sister Claire was radiant in that way people get when they're close to a wedding. She'd set her ring down on the bread plate while she washed her hands, and it caught the light like it wanted to be seen. Her fiancé Mark sat to her right shoulders, square posture, relaxed, but ready as if chairs and walls were just suggestions. He was polite, careful. He said sir to my father without thinking, and Dad noticed. Dad always noticed. I took the seat near the end, back to the window habit more than choice. The backyard was dark, the maple swaying leaves whispering against the glass. I placed my napkin on my lap, set my fork and knife parallel without looking, and folded my hands twice until they were still. Dad watched me do it. He always did. He liked to pretend he was the only one who understood order. "So," Dad said, cutting into the chicken with confidence, "Claire tells me you're still tinkering with that little hobby of yours." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at Mark. He wanted the line to land with witnesses. I smiled the way you do when you've learned that correcting someone costs more than letting it pass. "I keep busy," I said. It was true in the way weather reports are true, accurate but incomplete. Dad chuckled. "Busy," he repeated, tasting the word. "Sure, maps and notebooks and radios. Cute stuff, harmless." He lifted his glass, then tilted it toward Mark. "Now this is service, the real kind." Claire laughed, quick and bright, like a bell rung too hard. Someone else laughed because she did. The room loosened, the chandelier hummed, the chicken steamed. Dad's laugh widened, inviting the room to settle into the story he preferred. I felt the heat rise in my neck, a slow burn. I kept my eyes on my plate. I counted breaths, 4 and 6 out. You can endure a lot if you don't make it a spectacle. Mark didn't laugh. He was looking at my hands. Not the way men look when they're curious, but the way they look when something doesn't line up. His eyes tracked the faint scar at the base of my thumb, the callus along my index finger. He glanced at the way I sat, hips square, spine straight without effort, and then at my fork and knife resting perfectly aligned at the edge of the plate. Dad mistook the silence for encouragement. "She's always been like that," he said, nodding toward me. "Likes to feel important. Little projects. Keeps her occupied." Occupied. The word scraped. "I like order," I said softly. Dad waved a hand. "Everyone likes order. Some of us make a life out of it." The line was meant to be funny. It worked. Laughter moved around the table like a breeze. Then the fork fell. It wasn't dramatic at first, just metal on ceramic, a sharp, ordinary sound that didn't belong to the moment. Mark's fork slipped from his fingers and hit the plate, bounced once, then settled. He hadn't meant to drop it. His face had gone gray, the color draining as if someone had pulled a plug. He stared at me, eyes searching, then locking as if the room had narrowed to a point only he could see. "Wait," he said. His voice was low. "Wait." Claire turned to him. "Mark." He didn't answer her. He was looking at me, not my hands now, my face, the line of my jaw, the way I breathed. "Are you?" he swallowed. "Are you Rear Admiral Hart?" The laugh came immediately like a reflex. Dad laughed the loudest. He slapped the table once, delighted. "Oh, that's good," he said. "You hear that, Rear Admiral?" He shook his head, still smiling. She can barely keep a houseplant alive. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I'd learned long ago that denial can be louder than any confession. Mark didn't laugh. He stood. The chair scraped back sharp and final. His shoulders squared, heels together, hands snapping to his sides with a precision that cut through the room. He didn't look at Dad. He looked at me and snapped to attention, the motion clean and unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said. The word landed like a weight. The room emptied of sound. Even the chandelier seemed to quiet its hum, thinning to a thread. Claire's mouth was open. Dad's smile stalled, caught halfway between amusement and something else, confusion maybe, or the first hint of doubt. Claire whispered, "What are you doing?" He didn't take his eyes off me. "Permission to speak, ma'am," he said, the formality ringing true. I let a breath out slowly. "At ease," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He relaxed just enough to keep standing. "Sir," he said then, turning to Dad with respect that did not bend. "With respect, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Dad's laugh didn't return. He cleared his throat instead, a sound he used when meetings didn't go his way. "This is a family dinner," he said. "Sit down." Mark hesitated, eyes flicking to me. I nodded once. He sat, carefully. The chair legs found the floor again. The room exhaled, but it didn't recover. Not fully. No one reached for their fork. Dad looked at me as if seeing me for the first time and not liking the math. "What is this?" he asked. The question wasn't loud, but it carried. I folded my napkin once more, placed it on the table, and met his gaze. "It's just a name," I said. "Dinner's getting cold." No one laughed, not this time. After the fork fell and the room forgot how to breathe, we went through the motions. Plates were nudged, glasses were lifted and set down again without anyone drinking. The chicken cooled, butter filmed over the potatoes. Someone, Claire, I think, asked if anyone wanted more bread. No one answered. Dad stared at his plate like it might offer him instructions. People think a hobby is something you pick up to pass time, something you can drop when dinner's ready. What Dad meant by my little hobby was the room off the garage, the one with the pegboard and the battered desk, the radio set stacked neatly, the notebooks with dates and tides and margins filled tight. He meant the way I disappeared after dinner when I visited, the way I asked to borrow his extension cord, and returned it coiled the same way I'd found it. He meant the maps. He always meant the maps. When I was a kid, he called it fussing. "You worry too much," he'd say, watching me draw lines and arrows on graph paper while other kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. "You'll wear yourself out." He was wrong about why I worried. I wasn't afraid. I was attentive. At the table that night, I could feel Mark's attention like a second pulse. He wasn't staring anymore. He was listening the way men do when they've learned that listening keeps you alive. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He waited. Dad cleared his throat again. "You collect radios," he said, aiming the words at the room. "Old ones. That's the hobby, right?" I nodded, among other things. "Among," he repeated, suspicious. "You fix them up, tinker." That's what I said. I considered correcting him. I didn't. The truth has better timing than pride. What I do with radios isn't fixing. It's calibration. It's learning how sound moves when it's scared. It's knowing which frequencies lie when the weather turns. It's remembering that silence can mean connection just as often as it means failure. Dad saw boxes and wires. He didn't see the discipline. He didn't see the hours spent logging signal drift, the careful labeling, the checklists taped inside the desk drawer. He didn't see how my hand moved without my eyes, how I could tell by touch when a knob had reached the exact point it needed to be. He didn't see that I wasn't playing. I was practicing. "Why do you keep all those notebooks?" he asked, now gesturing vaguely. "You're not in school." I smiled. Habits outlast reasons. He snorted. "You could have done something useful with that focus." Mark shifted in his chair. Claire shot him a look that said, "Not now." He obeyed. For the moment. The notebook started because of my mother. She taught me to write things down when they mattered. Paper remembers when people don't, she used to say, tucking grocery lists into cookbooks and notes into my backpack. After she died, the notebooks became a place to put the things I didn't want to lose. Not feelings, those were heavy. Patterns, timings, What worked, what didn't. I learned early that if you keep your tools sharp, people stop asking what you're building. Dad had never come into the garage room. Not really. He stood at the doorway once years ago and shook his head at the clutter. Looks like a storm passed through, he said. It's organized, I replied. Sure it is, he said and walked away. At the table, he picked at his chicken. So he said, trying for lightness. Rear Admiral, huh? The word tasted strange in his mouth. He glanced at Mark, hoping for help. That a nickname or something? Mark met his eyes. It's a rank, sir. The word sir hit Dad like a mirror. He bristled. I know what a rank is. Of course, Mark said. Respectful, steady, I meant... It's not important, I said quickly. It's just what people call me at work. Claire stared at me. At work where... I took a sip of water. The glass was sweating. On base. Dad laughed again, but it didn't catch. You work on a base now. Since when? For a while. How long is a while? Long enough that the answer wouldn't help. Long enough. He opened his mouth to press. I cut in gently. Dad. He paused. He hated that. He hated when I used his name like a boundary. The truth about my hobby is that it kept me alive when nothing else would. It taught me to slow my breath when rooms went loud. It taught me to make decisions without needing applause. It taught me that the difference between a mess and a system is whether you know where to put your hands. I thought of the nights when the radio hissed, and the maps were spread and the stakes were quiet but sharp. I thought of the men and women who trusted the calm of my voice more than the certainty of their fear. I thought of how often the work looks like nothing from the outside. A woman at a desk, a notebook, a pen moving. Dad looked around the table, trying to reclaim the room. Well, he said, forcing a smile. Whatever it is, it's clearly impressed Mark. Mark didn't look impressed. He looked grateful. Sir, he said carefully. I recognized her because of how she listens. Dad frowned. Listens. Mark nodded. Most people hear noise. Some people hear structure. The chandelier hummed. The maple brushed the window. The room felt smaller, like a coat that no longer fit. I don't like secrets, Dad said. I don't keep them, I replied. I just don't advertise. Silence stretched. Claire pushed her chair back slightly as if to make space for something she didn't understand yet. Dad's eyes moved from me to Mark and back again, calculating. He had always been good at that. He'd just never been good at recalculating. My little hobby wasn't little, it was quiet. And quiet things scare people who rely on noise. I folded my napkin again, precise. If you want, I said, I can show you the room after dinner. Dad hesitated. He looked at the hallway, then at the table. He nodded once curt. We'll see. I took that as a yes, or as close to one as he could manage. Dad's house had always been arranged like a resume. Photos framed in identical black borders, medals in a glass case that never gathered dust. A flag folded so tight it looked like it might cut you if you touched it wrong. When I was growing up, I thought that was what love looked like, clean lines, no excess, everything in its place. It took years to understand that order can be a shelter or it can be a wall. He had served once long enough to make it his story, even after the uniform went back into a garment bag. The town knew him as dependable, the diner knew his coffee order. The church bulletin printed his name under committees with words like stewardship and honor. Men shook his hand and said, "Thank you for your service," and he nodded like he was receiving mail he hadn't ordered but kept anyway. He liked being needed in rooms where nothing complicated him. At home, he was quieter. The rules were louder than his voice. Shoes lined at the door, dishes stacked left of the sink. Lights out meant lights out. He taught me to stand straight before he taught me to throw a ball. He taught me how to fold a flag before he taught me how to ask for help. Praise was rationed. Silence was not. I learned early that love came with inspections. My sister learned a different lesson. Claire learned how to charm a room, how to laugh at the right moment, how to make people feel comfortable with her being there. Dad liked that. It made sense to him. She fit the story he wanted to tell, bright, easy, admired. When she brought Mark home the first time, Dad's shoulders relaxed the way they do when a problem solves itself. A uniform he recognized. A bearing he trusted. The future neatly boxed. I never fit that box. I tried once. I joined the track team because he said discipline builds character. I won races. He corrected my form. I aced classes. He asked why I didn't speak up more. When I told him what I wanted to do with my life, he went very still the way weather does before it turns. That's not for you, he said, not unkindly. Just certain. Certainty is heavy when it's wrong. After Mom died, the house lost its soft edges. She had been the translator, the one who could read Dad's silences and make room for them. Without her, the rooms echoed. He filled them with routine. I filled them with notebooks. We stopped talking about important things because they took too long to explain. We talked about gutters and weather and the neighbor's fence. When I left, he said, "Drive safe." When I came back, he said, "You look tired." Neither of us asked the questions that mattered because neither of us wanted the answers to rearrange the furniture. At the dinner table now, I could feel that old geometry returning. Dad leaned back, arms crossed as if bracing for impact. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled. That was worse. Anger burns off. Unsettlement lingers. "You never mentioned any of this," he said, finally, voice even. "Bases, ranks." "You never asked," I said. The words were plain. I didn't sharpen them. He flinched. Not much. Enough. Mark watched the exchange like a man learning a map in real time. Claire looked between us, her smile gone, replaced by something careful. She loved us both. That didn't make the math easier. "I raised you," Dad said. "I deserve to know." The sentence had carried him a long way in life. It didn't carry as far as it used to. "I know," I said. "You raised me to stand on my own." "That's not what I meant." "It's what you taught." Silence settled again, thick, but not hostile. I thought of the garage room, the pegboard, the way tools hang best when you respect gravity. I thought of how Dad had never once stepped inside. I thought of how some men confuse distance with control. "I didn't make fun of you," he said, trying another angle. "I was joking." "Jokes land where they land," I replied. "Sometimes they land on people." He rubbed his jaw, a habit from long meetings. "You think you're better than us now?" "No," I said. "I think I'm different." Different had always been the word he didn't know what to do with. It wasn't better, it wasn't worse. It didn't submit to rank. Mark cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may." Dad held up a hand. "This is family." Mark nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why it matters." Dad looked at him, then really looked. He saw the sincerity, the restraint, the respect that didn't bend into obedience. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, adjusted. I remembered a night years ago when I'd come home late, smelling like rain and oil hands stained with ink. He'd stood in the doorway and said, "You don't have to prove anything." I hadn't known how to answer then. I know now. Proving wasn't the point. Holding was. After dinner, Dad said abruptly, "You said you'd show me." "Yes," I said. He stood signaling the end of the discussion the way he always had. Old habits die with posture, plates scraped, chairs moved. The room breathed again, but differently. The chandelier hummed back to life. As we walked toward the hallway, I felt the weight of years move with us. This wasn't a reconciliation, it was a recalibration. Those take time. They require patience and a willingness to admit that the map you've been using doesn't show all the roads. At the threshold of the garage, Dad hesitated. He looked at the door like it might argue with him. I waited. Waiting had become a skill. He opened it. The garage room smelled like dust and machine oil and old paper, clean in the way workspaces are clean when every object has a reason to be there. Dad stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped behind his back posture, returning by instinct. He scanned the pegboard, the radios lined in patient rows, the notebooks stacked with their spines labeled in my small, precise handwriting. He didn't touch anything. He rarely did. Touching admits curiosity. I didn't know, he said, not looking at me. No, I replied, you didn't. I didn't start at the beginning. Beginnings invite debate. I started with the middle, the place where stories become work. I told him about my first posting without naming it, about the smell of salt and diesel, the way decks sweat before dawn, the sound a ship makes when it's awake and pretending not to be. I told him about learning to read people the way you read weather, the quick laugh that comes too fast, the pause before an answer that means a mind is elsewhere. I told him about radios that crackle like old throats, and the discipline of writing things down before memory edits them. I didn't tell him about fear. Fear is common. I told him about preparation. You joined the Navy, he said, as if confirming a fact he'd misplaced. Yes. When? Years ago. Why didn't you? Dad, I said it gently. He stopped. I showed him a notebook from early on the pages worn thin at the edges. Dates, tide tables, checklists written and rewritten until they fit reality instead of theory. I explained how plans look perfect until people touch them, how my job was to account for the human ways things go sideways. Not heroics, logistics, timing, quiet decisions that keep other people's bad days from becoming their last ones. You're not a SEAL, he said, glancing at Mark, who stood a respectful distance away pretending to study a radio. No, I said, I'm not. Dad nodded, relieved, then frowned. Then why? Because I don't have to be, I said. I work where the plan lives. I told him about the night a storm came in crooked and the radio started lying, about rerouting without announcing it, about moving the soft failure where you can see it so the hard one doesn't surprise you. I told him about the first time someone knocked twice on my desk before stepping out superstition or respect, I never asked which. I told him about the letters I kept from families who never knew my name, only that someone had made a call that let their people come home. I didn't list medals, I didn't say numbers. I let the work speak in its own grammar. The rank, Dad said finally, Rear Admiral. It came later, I said, it wasn't the point. He stared at a map pinned to the wall, lines overlapping like veins. They don't give those away. No, I agreed. Mark stepped closer, careful not to intrude. Sir, he said, her briefs were legendary, clear, calm. You could fit inside them. Dad looked at him sharply. You served under her. Mark shook his head. I served because of her. The distinction mattered. I saw Dad register it, file it somewhere new. The name Hart, Dad said slowly. People know it. In some rooms, I said. In others, it's just a name. He picked up a radio, then, surprising me, his hands were steady. He turned it over, noting the wear. You keep them old, he said. They don't panic, I replied. They tell the truth if you know how to listen. He set it down exactly where it had been. And this? He gestured to the notebooks. This is the hobby. This is the habit, I said. We stood there, the three of us, surrounded by quiet evidence. The house creaked as it always had. Outside, a car passed. Ordinary sounds. Extraordinary recalculations. I taught you some of this, Dad said almost to himself. You taught me to stand straight, I said. The rest I learned because I had to. He looked at me, then really looked as if measuring not height but distance traveled. You didn't need to hide. I didn't hide, I said. I worked. He nodded once, a small concession. Hart, he repeated. The name sounded different now. Less like a challenge, more like a fact. Mark cleared his throat. Sir, with respect, when people stand for her, it's not because of the rank. It's because she makes rooms safer. Dad absorbed that the way men absorb new doctrine, slowly, skeptically, but thoroughly when it sticks. He glanced back toward the dining room where plates waited, and a family sat suspended between stories. We should finish dinner, he said. Yes, I replied. As we turned back, I felt the weight shift, not lift, not vanish, but settle into a new balance. The name Hart would follow me either way. What mattered was what it lifted when it arrived. We returned to the dining room like people stepping back onto a stage after the scenery has been quietly rearranged. Nothing obvious had changed. The plates were where we left them, the chicken still steaming faintly, the chandelier still humming its tired hum, but the air had learned something new. It carried it carefully as if not to spill. Dad took his seat at the head of the table without the old certainty. He adjusted his napkin twice. Claire watched him, then me, then Mark, her smile gone soft around the edges. Mark sat with his hands folded, posture attentive but restrained, like a man waiting for instructions he hoped wouldn't come. No one spoke for a moment. The maple brushed the window again. Somewhere a clock ticked. So Dad said at last, clearing his throat. He aimed for casual and landed on brittle. Rear Admiral Hart. I met his eyes. Dad. He flinched again, smaller this time. People usually tell their families things like that. People usually ask, I replied. Claire let out a breath she'd been holding. I thought your hobby was I don't know, like model ships. I have those too, I said. They teach patience. Mark shifted, then leaned forward slightly. Sir, may I explain how I recognized her? Dad hesitated. Pride and curiosity wrestled. Curiosity won by a fraction. Go ahead. Mark nodded, choosing his words like tools. It wasn't the name at first. It was the way she reacted when you laughed. Dad stiffened. Reacted. She didn't, Mark said. That's what I noticed. No defense, no scramble. She held the room without taking it. That's uncommon. I felt my cheeks warm, but I kept my gaze steady. This wasn't about praise. It was about accuracy. And then Mark continued. She said something about order. The phrasing was exact. The cadence. It's how we brief when the stakes are real and the time is short. He glanced at me. I've heard that voice before. Over the net. Calm. Unmistakable. Claire's eyes widened. Over the net. Communications, Mark said. Operations. Dad shook his head once, trying to dislodge the picture forming. You're telling me my daughter. I'm telling you, Mark said gently, that when things went wrong for us, her plans held. Silence followed. Not the old silence that pressed. A different one. A listening silence. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. If this is true, he stopped. He didn't like hypotheticals. Why didn't anyone say anything? Because that's not how it works, Mark replied. The best work doesn't need witnesses. It needs outcomes. I watched Dad's hands curl around his fork. He lifted it, then set it down again as if unsure what it was for. He glanced at the door to the garage, then back to me. You let me make a fool of myself. I considered that. You made a joke, I said. The room decided what to do with it. He bristled. You could have stopped it. I did, I said quietly, by standing. Mark's chair scraped softly as he shifted, but he didn't stand again. He didn't need to. The first time had been enough. Sir, he said, turning back to Dad with respect, no one here is trying to embarrass you. I stood because it's a reflex. Because that name means something where I come from. Because I owe her. Owe her what Claire asked, her voice small. Mark looked at her, then at me, seeking permission. I nodded once. My team made it home, he said simply. That's what. The words fell without ornament. They didn't need any. Dad stared at the table. The chandelier hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, a dog barked, ordinary and grounding. I didn't know, Dad said again. This time it wasn't defensive, it was an admission. I felt the old ache stir, the one that wants to be seen, not elevated. I kept it in check. Knowing and asking aren't the same, I said. You taught me that. He looked up surprised. I did. Yes, I said. You taught me to check my assumptions. He almost smiled, almost. Claire reached for her water and finally drank. I'm proud of you, she said, and meant it in the way siblings mean it, laid a little awkward but sincere. Thank you, I said. Dad pushed his chair back slightly, then forward again, adjusting. We should eat, he said. Food's not getting any better. Plates moved, forks lifted. The room found a rhythm, tentative but real. Conversation returned in small pieces, whether the wedding venue a story about a neighbor's fence. But the undercurrent had changed. People listened differently. They measured their words. Halfway through the meal, Dad cleared his throat. After dinner, he said, not looking at me, I want to see that room again. Yes, I replied. Mark caught my eye and gave a small nod. Gratitude, respect. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. As the plates emptied and the night settled in, I realized something had already shifted. Not because a rank had been named, not because a man had stood, but because the laughter had stopped where it should have. Because the room had learned that some quiet things carry weight. The fork lay where it had fallen earlier, now washed and resting by Mark's plate. Ordinary again. But I would remember the sound it made when it hit, the way it cut through the noise, the way truth sometimes announces itself not with a speech but with a small, unmistakable clang. Dessert came out quieter than dinner had begun. Apple pie still warm, the crust flaking when the knife went through. Dad served it himself slower than usual, careful with the portions, as if the act of dividing something evenly might restore a sense of order. He placed a slice in front of me last, not pointedly, just last. The room had settled into a truce. Conversation stayed on the surface: work schedules, wedding colors, whether the maples would turn early this year. But underneath, something else moved. The recalculation wasn't finished. It rarely is after the first pass. Mark ate with the restraint of someone used to waiting for permission he no longer needed. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to ask questions that invited others in instead of closing them out. Dad noticed that. He always noticed men who could command a room without raising their voice. It was one of the things he admired most, though he rarely said so. At some point, Dad pushed his plate away. He stared at the pie like it had betrayed him. "Rear Admiral," he said again, testing the words. "That's high." "Yes," I said. "How high?" Claire asked, curiosity edging toward awe. "High enough to stop counting," I replied. Dad let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting years. "So, all those nights, all that time in the garage, you weren't hiding?" "No," I said, "I was building." He nodded slowly. "I used to think hobbies were how people avoided work." "Sometimes," I said, "sometimes they're how people survive it." Mark shifted. "Sir, if I may add something." Dad looked at him, then nodded. "Go on." "She never led with the rank," Mark said. "In the rooms where it mattered, she led with the plan. The rank followed because people trusted the plan." Dad absorbed that. "Trust," he said. "That's earned." "Yes," Mark said. "Daily." I watched Dad's shoulders ease by a fraction. Not surrender, recognition. "Why, Hart?" Claire asked suddenly. "Why do people know the name?" I hesitated. The answer wasn't flattering, but it was true. "Because I stayed," I said. "Because when things went wrong, I didn't leave the room." Dad looked at me then with something close to pride, quickly masked by habit. "You could have told me," he said, softer now. "I could have," I agreed. I didn't want to be believed for the wrong reasons. He frowned. "Wrong reasons?" "I didn't want you to see me because of a title," I said. "I wanted you to see me because I was already here." Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Dad stood abruptly, chair scraping. For a moment, I thought he might retreat into authority again. Instead, he walked to the sideboard and opened a drawer I hadn't seen opened in years. He pulled out a small envelope yellowed at the edges. He held it like it might crumble. "I got this a while back," he said. "Didn't know what to do with it." He handed it to me. Inside was a clipped article. No photo, just a paragraph about a coordinated evacuation during a coastal storm. A line at the end mentioned a Rear Admiral Hart whose planning prevented loss of life. Dad's handwriting ran beneath it, small and careful. "Thought this might be you." My throat tightened. He'd known more than he'd let on. He'd just never crossed the distance. "I kept it," he said. "Didn't ask, didn't want to get it wrong." I folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. "You don't get it wrong by asking," I said. "You get it wrong by assuming." He nodded, chastened but present, I assumed. Mark stood then, slowly, not snapping this time. He lifted his glass. "To the people who make rooms safer," he said, "even when no one's watching." Claire lifted hers. I did too. Dad hesitated, then joined us. The glasses touched lightly. The sound was small, but it carried. Afterward, as plates were cleared, Dad lingered by the table. "I used to think respect was about standing tall," he said. "Turns out it's about making space." I smiled. "That's a good correction." He looked at me, eyes steady. "I'm still learning." "So am I," said. The room felt taller then. Not because anyone stood, because something inside us did. The house emptied slowly the way it always had. Claire and Mark left first, her hand threaded through his, both of them quieter than when they arrived. At the door, she hugged me longer than usual. I really didn't know she whispered. "I know," I said. "You weren't looking for the same things." Mark met my eyes over her shoulder. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He nodded once, the kind of nod men give when a debt has been acknowledged but not erased. That was fine. Some balances aren't meant to be closed. Dad watched them go from the doorway, hands in his pockets. When the car pulled away, he didn't wave. He just stood there until the taillights disappeared. Then he turned back into the house as if stepping into a room that had been rearranged while he was outside. "You want coffee?" he asked, defaulting to ritual. "Yes," I said, defaulting to mercy. We sat at the kitchen table where so many small wars had been fought with rules and silence. The clock over the sink ticked louder here, honest about time passing, whether anyone liked it or not. Dad poured the coffee carefully, too carefully, then slid my mug toward me. It stopped an inch short. He nudged it the rest of the way. "I didn't ask," he said suddenly. I looked up. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the table, at the old burn mark from the pan I'd set down too hot all those years ago. He traced the edge of it with one finger like it might explain something. "I didn't ask," he repeated, not defensive, recording the fact. "No," I said, "you didn't." He nodded as if confirming coordinates. I thought asking would complicate things. "It does," I said. "That's not the same as wrong." He leaned back, exhaled. I expected the world to make sense if everyone followed the rules. "And did it?" I asked. A corner of his mouth twitched. "Not lately." We sat with that. Outside, the maple dropped a leaf. It scraped softly across the window and fell. "I used to think hobbies were distractions," he said after a while. "Ways to avoid responsibility." "They can be," I said. "They can also be rehearsals." He glanced toward the garage. "All that time, you were rehearsing." "Yes." "For what?" "For when it mattered." He considered that, then nodded. "You always did like to be ready." He stood and walked to the sink, rinsed his mug, set it upside down to dry. When he turned back, his posture was different. Less squared, more human. "I'm proud of you," he said. The words came out plain, no ceremony, no rank attached. They landed where they needed to. I didn't rush to fill the space after. Pride, I'd learned, needs room to breathe or it turns into performance. "Thank you," I said. He swallowed. "I don't know how to talk about the rest." "You don't have to," I said. "Not all at once." He nodded. "There's a seat," he said, gesturing toward the table. "If I wanted to come see your work sometime." "There's always a seat," I replied. "You choose where to put your hands." He smiled, then really smiled, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. "I'll figure it out." We stood there a moment longer, two people learning a new map. Then I gathered my coat. Outside, the night had settled into its usual quiet. I walked to my car and paused, hand on the door. The porch light cast a familiar circle on the concrete. Dad stood in it, older than he had looked all evening, but lighter somehow. "Drive safe," he said. "I will." As I pulled away, the radio clicked on by habit. Static, then a voice. The road stretched ahead, steady and known. I breathed in time with the lines passing under my headlights. Revenge, people think, is loud. It's a raised voice, a slammed door, a speech delivered at the exact moment someone deserves it. But the kind that lasts, the kind that heals instead of scars, feels more like stillness. Like choosing not to shrink when someone laughs. Like standing straight until the room remembers its own spine. My dad didn't stand at the table that night. He didn't snap to attention. But something in him shifted. Something important stood up later quietly when no one was watching. That was enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a room that changed, or a moment when someone finally saw you, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, or who this story made you think of. We share stories like this every day, stories about family dignity and the quiet strength it takes to stand tall. So consider subscribing if you don't want to miss the next one. Let's keep this journey going together.